we follow this guy out into the middle of nowhere? And I want to start there this morning asking this question of who are you following this morning? Because I think for all of us, this question comes up every single day, whether it's in relationships with our coworkers and our bosses, whether it's with our families, our sports teams. I think this question ultimately has to come up, especially in our spiritual life, of who are you following? Who are you going to follow? And I can promise you that this is the most important question you can be asking in your entire life. Before what major you're going to take in college, before who you're going to marry, before where you're going to settle down and get a house, this question of who are you going to follow is the most important question. I'm challenging this morning that if you think you're not following somebody, I want to tell you that you might actually be following somebody, you just don't know it. And so this morning we're going to be talking about, we're in this story called God's Messengers. And so we're in this entire kind of series of going from Genesis to Revelation of the entire breadth of the Bible. And so today in this chapter, there's a bunch of stories mixed in here of a bunch of major prophets, but today, instead of doing a 10,000-foot overview of a bunch of stories, we're going to dial in on one particular story of a prophet, and we're going to see what exactly God's doing in the story of Israel at the time. And so we're going to be talking about a few things from this story. So where we're going to be is 1 Kings 18, verses 16 through 39. If you have a Bible, go there, and I'll give you a little bit of context as we start this morning. So this story, it takes place around 8th to 9th century BC, and what's going on here is that Israel and Judah, as we talked about last week, Israel and Judah, they've split in half. So there's Israel to the north, Judah to the south, they're separate nations. And during this time, we see Israel and Judah continuing to spiral down and down and down. The kings, they continue to fall away from God, and what once was a prospering nation is now a nation that is actually trying to scrape for food and water. They're now in a 3-year famine and a 3-year drought. And so the reason being because of their idolatry. And Israel, they started to follow after gods of different countries, specifically from Tyre and Sidon, which are neighboring nations. And so the kings of the time, King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, they're the ones who established this kind of idolatry, this religion of the area. And so it became more and more prominent over their time. And then we see that God started a drought 3 years, that lasted 3 years. And then about halfway through the 3rd year, Elijah, he starts to become a notable prophet, and he confronts the king and queen. And so we pick up in verse 16, where he actually confronts the king Ahab. And it says this: Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you troubler of Israel?" And Ahab is saying this because he thinks that Elijah is the reason why this drought and famine is actually happening. And so Elijah says, "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." And so what we see here is a few different characters to kind of get the setting down for this story. So we have King Ahab, the king over Israel. We have Elijah the prophet, and then we have the prophets of Baal and Asherah, the false gods of the area, and the Israelites. And so we had to figure out what exactly is the tension here. We see Elijah is confronting the entire nation of Israel here, not just physically, but there's representatives. There's a lot of people here. There's 850 different prophets. And so there's a lot of people here in this story. And we see Elijah says to him that they're going to decide once and for all who is the one true God. And we see in verse 21, he says this: Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." In another translation, it says, "How long will you be paralyzed by indecision?" How long will you be paralyzed by indecision? Elijah, he's calling out Israel here on their inability to choose, on their inability to go and choose whether it's God or Baal. A few years ago, actually probably half my life ago, my dad, he took me to this Calgary Flames game. Is anyone a Flames fan here, by the way? A few people? Okay, sweet, cool. Go Flames. Awesome, sick. Yeah, get out of here. Um, this game that we went to, it was between Calgary and Toronto. And if you guys know anything about this particular time, it was during like the golden era of Calgary Flames, where it was like Jerome McGinley, Dion Phaneuf, Mika Kiprusoff, all these like awesome players. I can't remember if Kiprusoff was retired or not at this point, but this was right after Dion Phaneuf, he got traded to Toronto because of all that stuff going on with Calgary. And so he gets traded to Toronto, and this is the first time that Dion Phaneuf shows up to play against Calgary. And every single time he got the puck, he was just being booed. He was getting yelled at. They're like, this guy, like, we don't want this guy here. Like, get out of here. People are booing the entire time. I was like, man, this is wild. Like, people are getting pretty intense about this. And I remember at one point when we were watching the game, there's the Jumbotron in the middle of the ice. And there was this guy that they zoomed in on, and he was wearing one of the weirdest jerseys I've ever seen in my entire life, where it wasn't a Calgary Flames jersey, it wasn't a Toronto jersey, it was both at the same time, where they like Frankenstein's this jersey together to make a double jersey where half of it's Calgary and half of it's Toronto. I remember looking at my dad, and we were just like, yuck. Like, what is that? Like, that's disgusting. That's gross. Like, what's going on here? And we both were just like kind of thinking to ourselves, like, pick a side, right? Like, why aren't you picking a side? And I think for Elijah here, to go back to the story, he is saying the exact same thing to the Israelites, because in his day, it wasn't just either pick Baal or pick Yahweh. They were going after multiple different gods at the same time. So you would worship Baal in the morning, and then you go and worship Yahweh in the evening, and you just kind of pick and choose whatever you want to follow. And so Elijah here, what he's trying to do is he's trying to call them out on their indecision, and he's trying to get them to actually just make a choice, to actually make a decision here. And we see what the Israelites actually say in response to what Elijah says, which is nothing. It's silence. It says, but the people said nothing. They didn't know what to say because they didn't want to pick a side. Verse 23 says, get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it to pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I'll prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it as well. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The one who answers by fire, he is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good. And so Elijah here, he's creating a space for a kind of contest, so to speak. He's trying to get here at this point of, if your sacrifice lights up, then your God is true. If my sacrifice lights up, then my God is true. And he's just trying to say, hey, you need to make a choice here. You need to decide who you're going to follow, and whichever God is true, are you going to remain neutral to him or not? And ultimately, he pushes them outside of this neutrality to actually pick a side. And if we look at Canada today, I think if you look at our culture today, if you were to go into any sort of city, Lethbridge, Calgary, Edmonton, wherever it is, and you were to ask somebody, what religion is the true religion? I think by and large, you'd probably get a lot of people just saying, well, your truth is your truth. Or my truth, maybe I'm a Muslim, but maybe that's not for you. Maybe Christianity is true for you. Or maybe Mormonism is true for you. Or Buddhism is true for you. I think we see this a lot more each and every day. But I think the problem with this idea of neutrality, is that there is no true neutrality. So that's my first point, is that the problem of neutrality is that there is no neutrality. So we see in this story, there's 2 kingdoms at work in this story. There's the kingdom of light, and there's the kingdom of darkness. And Elijah is trying to show the people, hey, even if you think you're neutral in this, you're actually still part of the darkness, even if you're not choosing. We see Jesus, he illustrates this exact same point in the Gospels. He says this in Matthew chapter 12. The Pharisees, they believe that he's casting out demons in the name of Satan, in the name of Beelzebub. And he says this to the Pharisees. This is in verse 25 and 30 of chapter 12. Jesus says, every kingdom divided against itself will be ruined, and every city or household divided against itself will not stand. Whoever is not with me is against me, and whoever does not gather with me scatters. And we see in this story with Elijah, these Israelites are silent. In the face of darkness, in the face of false idols, in the face of idolatry, they're remaining silent. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, there's this movie that came out that apparently I've watched 15 times according to Kimball. he has this really great quote in this movie, and I think he's actually said this in real life. He says, "Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." See, if you're trying to switch jerseys every single time that the game changes, so to speak, you're not on God's team, you're on the losing team. If you're trying to switch every period, if you're trying to switch every quarter, if you're trying to switch every time the game changes, you're not on God's team, you're on the other team. Because at the end of the day, there's two sides. There's two sides. There's God's team and there's the team of darkness. Either you're on God's side and you're saying, I've experienced the gospel, I know the gospel, I want to live the gospel, I want to share the gospel with my neighbors, with the people around me, I want to love Jesus with my whole heart, my mind, my strength, and my soul. And at the end of the day, you will be with Jesus forever and ever, not because of the things you do, but because of what Jesus is doing through you. And so there's the kingdom of light. And then the kingdom of darkness is where you say, that Jesus stuff, that's cool and all, like him being fully God, fully man, like that's cool and all, but that's not really what I want to do. Like that's your thing, that's your truth, whatever it is. And at the end of the day, you're not going to be with God forever and ever. You're not going to be in the presence of God. And that's it. Those are your two choices. There's no gray area, there's no kind of in-between, and there's no junior varsity Christianity or senior varsity Christianity. There's either Jesus followers or not Jesus followers, God followers or world followers. There's only two choices. And so, are you going to be part of a divided kingdom, or are you going to be living wholeheartedly for God's kingdom? And so, you might be listening here and thinking to yourself, okay, great, awesome. I want to be a follower of Jesus. Like, I get that. I understand if I want to be a follower of Jesus, I need to be on his side. I want to be on the team of Jesus. But what does that look like practically? What does that look like to be a follower of Jesus? Is it just going to church on Sunday and taking communion, praying prayers, and I accepted Jesus when I was 3 years old? Like, what exactly does it look like? Is it being a part of a life group? Is it being in a community? Is it reading my Bible every day? Like, what does it look like to be a follower of Jesus? I want to point you to 1 John chapter 2, where the Apostle John, he says this. He says that we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands, is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in him. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. And just as a preface, that sounds impossible, and that's because it is impossible. It is impossible in of your own strength. And that's why when we're taking communion together, when we're at the Lord's table together, we're saying that Jesus died and rose again for us to live inside of us. Galatians 2:20, if you probably know it, where I have been crucified with Christ, it is no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me, through me. And so Jesus is the one doing the work through you, and all you had to do is just let him do it. And so practically speaking, again, okay, what does this look like in a day-to-day thing? Like Jesus says, you'll know them by their fruits. So what does that look like practically day to day? So I'll just give you a few examples. Are you swearing at your coworkers? Are you using your language to beat down somebody that you know? Or are you using your language to build others up? Are you edifying the people around you with your language? With your eyes, are you looking at women or men with lustful intent, or are you doing what Jesus says, and you are actually looking at people with a mindset of how God sees them, which is loved and cherished? Are you being open-handed or closed-handed with the resources that you have? Are you looking at the things you have with a closed hand, saying, "These are mine. This belongs to me, and this is mine, me, myself, and I"? Or are you using your things to be stewarded? Are you using them to help the people around you who have less than you do? Are you using your words to gossip around about people who are not in the same room? Or are you doing what Matthew 18 calls us to do, which is to call someone out if they have sinned against you, and to approach them with love and with grace, and to say, hey, if you've hurt me by this. And so there's so many different ways we can see the fruit, the practicality of what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. And I could go on and on and on, but ultimately, what being a follower of Jesus looks like today, it means following Jesus outside of these four walls. Not just in here, in the church. This is great, but this is not the fruit of Christianity. The fruit of Christianity is taking the gospel outside of these walls. Brandon Manning, he says this, I can't remember which book it is, but he says this. He says, the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, and deny him by their lifestyle. This is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And so now we find Elijah, after having confronted the Israelites' neutrality, he gives the Baal prophets an advantage. He tells them and he allows them to take whichever sacrifice they want first, to go first, and they're preparing it, they're starting to dance, they're doing their sacrifice, they're going nuts here, and they do it for hours and hours and hours. So I'm going to pick up again in verse 26, which says this. They called on the name of Baal from morning till noon, so for hours already. And they say, Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is God. Perhaps he's in deep thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. I think in the ESV it says that maybe he is relieving himself. Maybe he's in the bathroom, if you have that translation. That's a fun one. Then he goes on and says, so they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice, which was around 3 p.m. But there was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. Which leads me to my second point, which is false gods don't deliver. False gods don't deliver. So back in ancient Israel times, ancient Near East, this name Baal for this deity, we see it throughout the entire Old Testament. And we see it again specifically in this story. But the word Baal is not just for one particular god. It's actually for a lot of gods. And the word Baal actually just means spiritual lord. And so it's a title. And so we see these Baals throughout the entire Old Testament. And there's the storm deity Baal, there's the Baal of fertility, there's the Baal of partying, there's the Baal of wealth, and you can go on and on with this list. And so you might respond to that and say, oh, well, we don't really have Baals today, right? Like we have, there's religions where there's Shintoism and Buddhism where they have millions of gods that they worship all the time. But Western society, we don't really have Baals that we bow down to. We don't have statues that we bow down to. We don't have wooden idols that we bow down to. And just as a little kind of emphasis here, I'd encourage you to take something out of your front pocket and ask that same question. Because I think today, we don't worship idols. We don't worship stone. We don't worship wood. But I think whatever we give our time to, whatever we give the most of our attention to, that is something that we bow down to. And we talked about this last week, how Kimball brought up this quote, I think it was from Tim Keller, that said, whatever you give the most attention to, whatever you give the most of your imagination to, the most of your affections, that in of itself is an idol in your life. And just like the Israelites back then, I think we have Baals today. We may think that we're so far advanced, we may think that we're so far beyond this ancient civilization, but in reality, we're behind in some ways because they at least confronted and understood that they worship things. And we in of ourselves, we think we don't worship things, but in of itself, we do have spiritual masters in our lives. And so if it's not God, it's something else. If it's not God, for you, it could be Instagram. It could be your kid's future. It could be TikTok. There could be so many different things in your life taking up that space where God wants to dwell. I think I've shared this story before. When I was in Bible college, I was there for 2 years, but there was this position that you could get, which they called it an internship. It also goes by RA, residential assistant. And it's just this thing where you can stay there for another year, you can be on staff, and you get to help people in kind of like a pastoral way, where you get to be with people, pray with people, get to share your heart with people, and you get to help organize worship nights, you get to organize road trips and all this sort of stuff, and for the amazing price of free, which is every kid's dream in Bible college, where you just get to do everything for free. I was like, wow. I get to be paid nothing and be working at a Bible college? That sounds amazing. That's so cool. And so I did what everyone else did at the time, and I applied. I applied for this back at the very beginning of winter school, which this was about a 1 year, the first year was about 9 months. And so I applied for it. And for the first few months, I didn't really think much of it. We didn't really talk about it much. But then slowly over time, as the time got closer to actually decide who's going to be the next interns, everyone around campus was just like, oh, is it going to be this person? Is it going to be this person? Is it going to be Carson? Is it going to be this guy? Like, who is it going to be? I remember at this point, there was times where I actually couldn't fall asleep because I was so anxious about who is going to be picked for this position. And there's people in my life who are saying, Carson, like, you're made for this. Like, Carson, you should do this. I would be shocked if you don't get chosen for this particular role. And then I got rejected. I did not get picked, to everyone's surprise, to my own surprise. And looking back at it, it's funny, but like in the moment when I found out, like, I was devastated. I was completely devastated. And we were in this dining hall with a bunch of other students, and man, the scene was really sad. Like, there's people crying, there's people yelling, it was insane. There was a lot of emotions going on. And I remember just sitting there and being like, man, like, this wrecked me. Like, this was something that just hit me really, really hard. And looking back now, and even in my life today, I think this is a much larger symptom of an issue in my life, which is this idol of validation. And see, for me, for growing up in my life, I needed to be validated. I needed people to say, Carson, that was really great. Carson, that was a good message that you gave. Carson, that was a really good job that you did. And I needed people to validate me based on how good I was doing. I needed people to come up to me, and if people didn't tell me after a message or after a sermon and say, Carson, that was awesome, I would feel like gross inside. I feel like, was that good? Like, did I do a good job? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? Am I being rewarded with more status, with more opportunities, with more connections? Am I doing things right? And I'd be anxious. I would be scared. I didn't know what to feel. And I felt like I was a failure if I didn't live up to my own expectations. And that led me to burnout. That made me spiral into this burnout. But maybe for you, validation isn't an idol for you. I know for a lot of people today, an idol is pornography, where for women, this idea of pornography, they look at pornography and say, hey, I need to be like this woman, I need to be like this person on this screen, and if I want to have a fulfilling relationship with a man, if I want to have a lasting and great relationship with this person, I need to perform just like this woman on this screen. And it leads women to just desire to be loved and cherished and accepted based off how well they can do in bed. And I just want to say, if that's what you struggle with, that's a lie from the pits of hell. And for men, on this exact same point, you might look at pornography and you might say, hey, I want a woman just like that. Someone who can do well for me. Someone that looks absolutely perfect and is airbrushed to the nines. And as you continue on in your life, you look around, you're saying, hey, can someone fill this role for me? Can someone look this good for me? Can someone do and perform this thing for me? And then you end up having high expectations, and you end up paying the consequences because no one can meet your standards. And so I think our worship of Baals may not look the same, but it sure is alive and well today. Christopher Wright says this in his book, Hear Your Gods. He says, the worship of Baal is alive and well in Western culture, with their idolizing of sex and money. As the Canaanites and the Israelites after them worship fertility in its broadest sense, so we worship its modern equivalents. But sometimes we might not be worshiping something that might just be outside of us, or something that can have an external look. But sometimes I think it actually goes internally, and we have to look inside. This is from verses 26 and 29. I'm just going to repeat this. It says, they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. They shouted louder and started to slash themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. I was reading through this story, and I find it fascinating just how much time, especially when it comes to idolatry, that people are just giving so much of their affections and so much of their attention to this God. When I was living in Japan, there was this ceremony we went to. We were just curious at Bible college. We wanted to see what was going on. And there was these shrines that people would actually bow down to, and they gave their crops to it, they gave seeds to it, and we're just in the back watching this, just being like, this is interesting, like, what's going on here? And then we see at the very end of it, they had this giant shrine for Mount Fuji, which they believe is a deity. And they would go to this shrine, and then people would link hands and just be like spinning around like a whirlpool for like an hour and a half, just like running and running and running and running. We're like, what is happening? Like, this is wild. It's super interesting to be kind of like looking from the outside. But what I saw there, and we can see here in this text, is that there's this idea, this air of performance. This air that you need to perform for this God. And we see that the Baal worshipers say, God, answer us. They're calling on him. They're trying to control him and the outcome. And we see that there's this reversal. There's a reversal of God being the servant and the servant demanding from God. And they say, if you can just bring rain down, God, we'll worship you more. If you can just send food for us, God, Baal, we'll worship you more. If you just give me this relationship, God, we will worship you more. If you can secure my future, we will worship you more. If you can just do this one thing for me, I will worship you more. And we see that there's this twisting of the arm in the Baal worshipers, and I think in us today. Recently, I've only been doing young adults for, I guess, a year now. And it's been awesome. I've been loving it. It's been super great. And the past few months, as I've been doing this, I've been trying to get better at asking these two questions. I think I've shared them up here before, but I want to share them again. It's two questions, just to kind of give you an idea, a picture of what exactly Christianity means to you. And so the first question is, between 1 and 10, 1 being not so certain, 10 being certain, how certain are you if you died today, would you go to heaven? And so just think about that right now for a second. Between 1 and 10, 1 being not so sure, 10 being sure, how certain are you that if you died today, would you go to heaven? And so just have a number in your head, 1 to 10. Second question is similar. If you were to die today and you were to stand before God and he asked you this question of why should I let you in, what would you say? What would you say to God? And so I've been asking these questions specifically to young adults within the past few months. And I've gotten everything from a 3, I've gotten a 4, I've got 7s, I've got 9s, I've got 8s, I've got everything. I've got everything between 1 to 9 pretty much. And then I asked the second question, and the answers always fascinate me because it's always, I've done blank. I've always been going to church. I've been praying my entire life. I've been reading my Bible every day. I grew up in this. Why wouldn't you let me in, God? I've been doing this. And so if that's you, if you started that question with I've done, I would just challenge you for a second to ask, do you trust in the death and resurrection of Jesus for you? Is this idea of you getting into heaven based on what you've done, or is it based on what Jesus has done for you? And I've seen this so often in ministry where people stop going to church, they stop following Jesus. And I ask them, hey, why'd you stop going to church? Like what caused you to stop? And it's always something that happened in their life where I wanted a relationship, I was following God, I was reading my Bible, I was praying, and I found a guy, and we were dating, we got married, but then he divorced me. So God, it didn't work out. I don't want to follow you anymore. Or maybe, I've heard this before too, where, God, I was following you, I went to school, I got the degree, I got the major, there was a job I really wanted, and I prayed about it, and I felt like you were calling me into it, but God, you didn't give it to me, so I stopped following you. And it's this idea of, God, if you don't follow through, if you don't give me these results, I'm going to stop following you. And I just want to say, from the bottom of my heart, with the most love I possibly have, if that's you, you are not following God, you are following yourself. You are following after this idea of self-worship with Jesus wrapped around it. And so I just want to challenge you, if that's where you're at today, look at the cross, look at Jesus. And I challenge you to follow after the one true God. And so that's my third point, my last point, which is that God always delivers. So we see the Baal worshipers, they're dancing, they're slashing themselves, they're crying out to this Baal for hours and hours, but nothing's happening. We see that nothing is happening. But now it's Elijah's turn. So Elijah, what it looks like he has a severe disadvantage because first, he let the Baal worshipers go first. He let them do all their stuff and kind of do everything they need to do. But then he pours 3 giant barrels of water onto his sacrifice. And just a reminder, This is during a drought. So water wasn't really a big thing they had back then. So every time he's pouring water, tension is rising and being like, what is this guy doing? Like he's wasting a precious resource. And then we see Elijah. He's about to make the sacrifice in verse 36. It says this. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and you are turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. So God, he did what he always does. He showed up. He shows up time and time again, and we see this throughout the Bible, how he consistently and faithfully shows up for his people. We see this with the Exodus, with Moses, how he shows up at the Red Sea with a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. We see this with Daniel in the lion's den, how one man stands up against the king, and God shows up and saves his life. We see with David and Goliath how this shepherd boy goes up against Goliath, and God follows through and is faithful to him. But ultimately, where we see God show up in the most world-altering, earth-shattering way is on the cross. And in this story with Elijah, we see how God, he showed up in a fire. He showed up on a mountain, going up, and there's a sacrifice for the in front of this entire crowd. And in the Gospels, we see Jesus, this perfect life, this perfect sacrifice on a hill, in front of a crowd shouting, crucify him, crucify him. But the beautiful part of this story is that God showed up. He showed up by raising Jesus from the dead after 3 days and defeating death and showing to everyone that Jesus lived the life that you and I can't live. He died the death that you and I deserve to die on the cross for our sins so that we can have eternal life with God forever and ever. Romans 5:8 says, God shows his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And so if Jesus died for my sins, how can I keep on living in my sins? If someone gave his life for me, wouldn't I want to give my life for him? The answer is, if you want to keep living for yourself, the answer is you don't want to keep living for yourself. He changes you. The Holy Spirit enters into you. He moves you. He moves you to love the things that he loves, to hate the things that he hates, to cherish the things that he cherishes. And when you sin, because we still will, we are imperfect here on earth, we can shout from the rooftops and ask this question of, who can separate us from the love that's in Christ? And that's a rhetorical question, because nothing can separate us from the love of God. And so as he lived and died for you, now go and live for Christ. And so, in summary, we talked about how the problem of neutrality is that there is no neutrality. We talked about how false gods never deliver, and how the one true God always delivers. And so, before we wrap up, before we head out, I just want to give a second for you guys to respond to this, because whenever we give a sermon here, whenever I preach up here, I don't want this to just be an information exchange. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think God is still moving and working through everything going on here. But I just want to give you a second, and you'll see in your pews, there's a piece of paper and there's a few pens. Hopefully there's pens around here, probably scattered throughout the entire pews. But I want you to answer this question on your piece of paper. What is causing me not to follow after God wholeheartedly? What is causing me not to follow God wholeheartedly? For myself, like I said before, validation was something that was an idol in my life. It was this thing that it caused me anxiety, it caused me fear, it caused me bitterness towards the people around me. It's something I struggled with. But for me today, my future is something that I would say has been an idol in my life. I wanted to start school, I wanted to do and get on with this education stuff, but I had to keep waiting. I'm like, God, can I just start, please? I want to give this to you, and it is hard. It's difficult. And for me, that's my future has been something that I've had to consistently give to God, but it's still been an idol for me. And so for you, it could be a number of things. It could be pornography. It could be a toxic relationship. It could be your future. It could be your kids' future. It could be so many different things. And so just write down whether it's one word, a sentence, whatever it is. And what I want you to do 2 things with this. The first thing is that if you wrote something down, and if you can do this with a clear conscience, I just want you to lay it down at the cross here. Because Jesus, as we talked about already, he lived and died for us, and he also died so that we don't have to live for our idols. We don't have to live for the validation of other people. We don't have to live for the acceptance of something on a screen. We don't have to live so that we're always anxious about our futures. And so just as an act of worship, as an act of glorifying Jesus, if that's something you need to do today, I would just say lay it down at the cross. Lay it down at the cross because Jesus died for everything in your life. He died for these idols, to these idols. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that if there's someone in your life that you trust, if there's somebody in your life that you can talk with, whether it's a life group or someone, a friend, a close family member, I would say share this with them. We already talked about this morning how we need to be living in community as the church. This is something where if you feel like you need to get this off of your chest and speak with somebody, do it. This is an opportunity for you to hear and experience the gospel with the people around you, and we need to do that in community. So whether that's a friend, a close family member, a roommate, your spouse, whatever it is, I would just say share this with them and ask yourselves the question of how can we best help each other get through this and get over this idol. And so College Drive, I would just say this: let's not be a people who stand in neutrality, but let's be a people who live for Jesus wholeheartedly. And so let me pray that God will speak to us right now, and you'll have a moment to write it down, leave it at the cross, and let's just respond to worship together. And so Jesus, I thank you so much that you are a God who doesn't just leave us in the dust. You didn't just die and rise again and just leave us to our own devices, but God, you paid the price for us. We see in the story of Elijah, God, that you are the perfect sacrifice for us, past, present, and future. And Jesus, I just pray if there's something on our hearts now that you're speaking to us, if there's something that we need to give to you, Jesus, I pray that we can just give it to you. We can bow it down to you in worship and awe of the King of Kings and of the Lord of Lords. And Jesus, I just pray that for all of us, God, that if there's someone on our hearts that doesn't know you, Jesus, if there's someone that needs to experience the good news of you, God, that we can go out of these walls. We can go into the community around us and we can ask and proclaim who needs to know the good news and how can we best share the good news. So God, I pray that you will speak to us now, speak to our hearts, and God, we just praise you and we thank you. In your name, amen.